"If we cannot stay at Alamein alive, we will stay there dead," British Lieutenant-General Bernard Montgomery told his 8th Army in October 1942. Standing at this dusty Egyptian railway outpost just 60 miles west of Alexandria, Monty was driven forward by intelligence that even Hitler in Berlin didn't know. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox commanding the Afrika Korps, was running out of gas. But what Germany's most celebrated general lacked in fuel for his tanks, he made up for with a secret weapon. The Allies called it the Devil's Garden, and it was Rommel's deadliest trap of the North African campaign. In front of it, British Sherman and Crusader tanks sat immobilized in the 100-degree heat of the western desert, perfect targets for German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, repurposed as tank killers. To get Rommel, the British would have to enter the garden's gates, and the devil waited there, ready to water the ground red with blood. Disgrace. By 1941, Hitler's frustration with Italy's fiasco of a North African campaign could not be hidden beneath diplomacy anymore. Mussolini's thrust into Egypt had backfired spectacularly, leaving his men just clinging to a little piece of Libya as Britain seized the moment, reaching for key ports and positioning itself strategically to threaten Axis dominance in the region. Thinking that if you wanted something done right, you had to do it yourself, Hitler deployed an elite German force to stabilize the front. They were called the Afrika Korps, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, famed for his daring strategies. The man wasted no time upon arriving in Libya to launch a surprise offensive that rapidly reversed Axis fortunes. The British felt untouchable. They had crushed the Italians, and they dismissed any possibility of resurgence and were stunned as Rommel pushed them back decisively into Egypt. In contrast, the Australian-held port town of Tobruk refused to buckle, withstanding 8 hellish months of constant bombardment. The garrison there endured artillery barrages, bombing runs, and ground assaults. Rommel threw everything in his playbook at them, but Tobruk had no intention of falling. The Australians held their ground until December 1941, when Operation Crusader finally punched through to them. The offensive drove Rommel out of the city and sent him scrambling back across the desert, bleeding resources the whole way. Again, the British got cocky. They thought they'd broken Rommel for good and let their guard down. It was a big mistake. On January 21st, 1942, Rommel struck back with lightning speed, catching the Allies with their pants down. His signature fast-moving warfare pushed the British right back toward Tobruk. As Rommel closed in, the British scrambled to fortify Tobruk, digging trenches, stringing barbed wire, planting mines, and setting tank traps. Rommel first probed the defenses head-on, but made little headway, so he got clever. On May 27th, he swung around for a southern assault that nearly broke through. When that faltered, he quickly pivoted again, feinting west before smashing through the northeast perimeter with Italian support. By June 11th, Tobruk's outer ring had collapsed. The city was surrounded. Inside, confusion reigned as contradictory orders flew back and forth. General Ritchie faced an impossible situation. His superiors demanded he both hold Tobruk indefinitely and evacuate if defeat loomed, destroying everything useful on the way out. In the end, Ritchie pulled back, abandoning the 2nd South African Division to face Rommel alone. On June 20th, Rommel unleashed hell. The Luftwaffe pounded the city while artillery tore up defenses. German engineers bridged the anti-tank ditches, and Rommel's tanks rolled in. The Allies fought bravely at Palestrina Ridge, but German armor quickly broke through the last defensive lines. Troops trying to escape under fire were cut down or captured. By nightfall, Axis forces controlled the city and seized mountains of supplies. The next day, June 21st, the British surrendered Tobruk. Over 32,000 Allied soldiers marched into POW camps. Churchill was crushed, calling it, quote, a bitter moment. Defeat is one thing. Disgrace is another. Rommel, now a field marshal, cemented his Desert Fox reputation and changed the face of the North African campaign. Race for Alexandria. The fall of Tobruk in June 1942 rocked both Europe and Africa, reshaping how everyone viewed Axis powers. German and Italian papers went wild, declaring Egypt was next and predicting imminent victory at Cairo and the Suez Canal. Soon, North Africa would be part of the Axis Empire. Mussolini got caught up in the excitement, making a ridiculous show of arriving in Tripoli on a white horse dressed for a parade, already dreaming of his grand entrance into Cairo. Rommel, though, wasn't interested in parades. He was a pragmatist. He immediately put Tobruk's spoils to use. The trucks, fuel, and ammo became the engine driving his Afrika Korps eastward against the battered British 8th Army. Just 3 days after taking Tobruk, he was already pushing hard toward Mersa Matruh, smelling blood in the water. The British, seeing disaster looming, brought in General Auchinleck to stop the bleeding. Looking at his tired, demoralized troops, Auchinleck made the smart call. Pull back to El Alamein, a dusty railway stop with natural defensive advantages. El Alamein was perfect. Sea to the north, the impassable Qattara Depression to the south. Rommel's famous mobility wouldn't help him here. At Mersa Matruh, the surrounding New Zealand division faced annihilation. In a desperate gamble, 10,000 Kiwi soldiers fixed bayonets and charged through German lines under cover of darkness. They lost 6,000 men, but the breakout became a symbol of Allied grit. The retreat to El Alamein was brutal, 109 miles of scorching desert. Auchinleck quickly fortified ridges at Miteria, Rouaisat, and El Halfa, backing them with armored reserves. By the time Rommel's exhausted forces reached El Alamein, their supplies were running low, and morale was cracking. On July 1st, Rommel slammed into the British line and hit a wall of artillery fire and minefields. Every attack met the same fate. Auchinleck sprung his trap, sending British tanks to hammer Rommel's exposed southern flank, driving his panzers back in blinding sandstorms. Meanwhile, Rommel's veteran 90th Light Division suffered a humiliating defeat against South African troops, retreating in chaos, while the Italian Ariete Division simply collapsed under New Zealand pressure. The fighting at Rouaisat Ridge was savage. Captain Charles Upham, despite multiple wounds, kept attacking enemy positions, earning an incredibly rare Second Victoria Cross. Rommel later admitted these were, quote, the worst days I have lived through. Still, Allied unity was fraying. Australian and New Zealand commanders openly criticized British tactics after several disastrous tank battles. In the end, El Alamein put a stop to Rommel's seemingly unstoppable advance towards Cairo and Alexandria. Despite horrific casualties, Auchinleck achieved a crucial defensive victory, forcing the Desert Fox to face his limitations. Wrath of the Desert Fox. Reinforcements trickled into North Africa over those summer months, with about 24,000 troops and 11,000 Luftwaffe personnel arriving in rickety Ju-52 transports. But they weren't much help to these soldiers, who landed with no artillery, no tanks, no troop carriers, and barely any ammo. They were just more mouths to feed for Rommel's already strained supply lines. The Rumkey Parachute Brigade was the one bright spot. 4,000 hardened paratroopers, led by Major General Bernard Montgomery, tough as nails and ready to fight. But even these elite troops couldn't mask Rommel's desperate situation. His men were running on fumes, literally, as British planes and ships hammered every Axis vessel trying to reach the port from Tripoli to Tobruk. Thanks to ultra-intelligence, the broken Enigma code, Montgomery knew Rommel was critically short on fuel. He anticipated an attack on Alam el-Halfa Ridge and prepared meticulously. He stationed the fresh 44th Infantry Division alongside his veterans on the ridge, dug in anti-tank guns and artillery, and anchored 170 American Grant tanks in hull-down positions to minimize exposure. His orders were crystal clear. No charging out like cowboys. Stand firm and make Rommel come to them. Rommel, desperate but still dangerous, hatched an audacious plan. He'd feint toward the British center while sending his armor sweeping around their southern flank, then wheel north to trap them before racing to Alexandria. The riskiest part of his scheme involved dropping Ramkey's paratroopers and the Italian Folgore Division to capture bridges near Cairo and Alexandria. But reality intervened. The airborne operation was scrapped, leaving just the ground assault. On August 30th, as night fell, Rommel made his move. The Afrika Korps surged toward the British southern flank, hoping to use their legendary mobility. Instead, they got bogged down in carefully laid minefields, lit up like Christmas trees by parachute flares from British aircraft. Artillery pounded the stalled columns mercilessly. Dawn found Axis forces battered, but finally through the minefields, only to face British armor dug in on Alamein Ridge. Rommel, watching his fuel gauges drop, considered pulling the plug, but Major General Bayerlein urged him to press on, suggesting they turn north earlier to save distance and fuel. Reluctantly, Rommel agreed. Luck seemed to smile briefly when a fierce sandstorm swept the battlefield, grounding British planes. Axis tanks frantically refueled in the swirling dust. By mid-afternoon, though, the air cleared and exposed the German and Italian tanks to waiting British guns. From Alamein Ridge, observers watched an incredible sight. 120 German tanks emerging from the dust, heading straight for the entrenched British 22nd Armored Brigade. The Germans opened fire first, their superior guns outranging the British Grants and drawing first blood. But the British didn't take the bait. They held their place, just as they were told. As the German tanks crept closer, hidden British six-pounders waited silently. At just 300 yards, point-blank range, they opened up, catching the Germans completely by surprise. Rommel's veterans, used to British tanks charging wildly into their trap, pressed on bravely, but took devastating losses. For once, Rommel's favorite trick had backfired spectacularly. At nightfall, Rommel pulled his mauled tanks back several miles. Both sides had lost about 20 tanks and worked through the night recovering damaged vehicles. Montgomery hammered Rommel's vulnerability, sending planes to tear up Axis supply lines in the darkness. The next morning, a desperate Rommel probed again toward Alamein, hoping to draw out British armor. Montgomery simply refused the bait, as he had done before. He was beginning to understand Rommel's game. Instead, British aircraft pounded Rommel's exposed forces, forcing another retreat. By September 6th, Rommel had withdrawn to his starting lines. He held Himmelmatt Ridge, but Montgomery was happy to let him have it. He wanted Rommel to see the dummy installations there, sowing confusion about future British plans. Alamein cost the Axis about 2,800 casualties and precious tanks and vehicles. British losses were fewer, around 1,750, a clear victory, both tactically and strategically. Rommel's commanders bickered over who was to blame. Some thought the Desert Fox had hesitated when victory was within reach. Others understood that pushing harder might have destroyed his entire armored force. Either way, Alamein spelled doom for Rommel's once mighty Afrika Korps. Superstar Generals. Montgomery was fighting two battles at once. He had to beat Rommel on the battlefield, sure, but first, he needed to rebuild his broken 8th Army's confidence and fighting spirit, and fast. Despite being seriously ill, chronic stomach problems, liver issues, high blood pressure, sinus trouble, and bone-deep exhaustion, Rommel remained larger than life. Even British soldiers spoke of him with a mix of fear and respect, almost like he was superhuman. Montgomery knew he needed to create his own legend to counter this. At first, he went with an Australian digger's hat, covered in regimental badges, but he soon switched to something more striking, a black Royal Tank Corps beret. In a ballsy move, he even had Monty painted on his command tank. It was risky, making himself such an obvious target, but it sent a message. There was a new boss in town. But Monty wasn't just about image. He knew fancy hats wouldn't win battles. His men needed serious preparation, hard training, and their confidence back. Churchill kept pushing for a quick offensive, but Montgomery refused to budge until his army was ready. He launched intense training programs, pulling brigades off the front lines to run them through brutal, realistic exercises. Soldiers practiced mine clearing, coordinating tanks with infantry, fighting at night, and maintaining communications under fire. They drilled working with artillery barrages and air support until it became second nature. When the time came to fight, Montgomery wanted every move to be automatic, confident, precise. To keep Rommel guessing, Monty set up an elaborate ruse at the southern end of the Alamein line. They built fake tanks, phony headquarters, and dummy supply dumps. They even created false radio chatter and kept units visibly active, so German reconnaissance planes would report major troop movements there. Meanwhile, the rail forces quietly slipped into position at the northern sector for the actual attack. As the offensive neared, Montgomery's language got downright bloodthirsty. He told his officers to work their men into a frenzy. On September 23, 1942, Montgomery got a lucky break in his personal duel with Rommel. The Desert Fox left for Germany on medical leave, handing command to General Georg Stumm, a panzer commander with solid experience in France and Russia. While Rommel was being celebrated back home, Montgomery seized his chance to boost his own status and solidify his army's fighting spirit. But Rommel hadn't made things easy before leaving. He prepared a defense with 500,000 mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, laid in 2 massive belts. These were covered by artillery, machine guns, and those dreaded 88mm anti-tank guns that could punch through any Allied armor. German and Italian infantry divisions formed the front line, with armored divisions strategically positioned behind them for counterattacks. Reserve forces waited along the coast, ready for any amphibious landings the British might attempt. Montgomery had the numbers: 195,000 troops, over 1,000 tanks, 2,300 artillery pieces, and 530 aircraft. But he knew quantity alone wouldn't crack Rommel's defenses. He had to forge his separate units into one deadly weapon. The Desert Air Force, now ruling the skies with Spitfires and American B-25 bombers, became the sharp edge of his sword. He restructured his army into 3 corps: the infantry-heavy 30th and 13th, and the tank-dominated 10th Corps. His front line was a 40-mile stretch of fighters from across the Empire and Commonwealth. Australians stood shoulder to shoulder with New Zealanders, Highlanders, South Africans, Indians, Greeks, and French troops alongside British units. Behind them waited the armored divisions, coiled springs, ready to exploit any breach. Monty's plan hinged on confusion and split focus. He'd hit the Axis in both north and south simultaneously, keeping them guessing about his real target. Up north, the 30th Corps would punch through between Materia Ridge and the Mediterranean, creating a gap for the 10th Corps' tanks to pour through and engage the enemy armor in open country. Down south, the 13th Corps would try to seize Himmelmatt Ridge, forcing Axis reserves to commit too early. Meanwhile, the legendary Desert Rats of the 7th Armored would wreak havoc on enemy supply lines. As the battle day crept closer, hiding their moves grew more demanding. Soldiers spent daylight frozen in their holes, barely breathing. Come sunset, they'd crawl out just long enough to wolf down food, light up a cigarette, and knock back that precious Navy rum, the good stuff they saved for when it could be their last drink. When the clock struck 9, under a bright full moon, infantry crept to their kickoff spots. They weren't just fighting to crack Rommel's maze of minefields and machine guns. The idea was to defeat the Desert Fox myth itself. Monty's attack. At precisely 9:25 p.m., thunder rolled across the southern sector as 230 British artillery pieces opened fire on German positions. Previously quiet, transformed instantly. Desert Air Force bombers appeared 10 minutes afterward, their engines droning above as dark silhouettes crossed the moonlit dunes below. Northern sectors remained momentarily calm. This changed at 9:40 p.m. Northern positions suddenly erupted in coordinated violence, 460 artillery guns unleashing fire simultaneously, while aircraft delivered their payloads from above. The British infantry, hearts racing, rose from their positions and advanced into Rommel's last desperate snare, the Devil's Garden, an expanse of scorched desert seeded with 500,000 mines. The Highlanders of the 51st Division charged with bayonets fixed, bagpipes defiantly skirling into the chaos. Leading them bravely, Piper Duncan McIntyre, just 19, marched forward playing Highland Laddie, his music piercing through explosions until a final burst of machine gun fire silenced him forever. Their mission was perilous. Carve narrow lanes through minefields defended by machine guns firing relentlessly at knee height, and hidden artillery zeroed precisely onto their paths. The New Zealanders, backed by the 9th Armored Brigade, hit the northern part of Materia Ridge, while South Africans with Valentine tanks tackled the southern section. Despite fierce resistance, the Kiwis reached their objectives by sunrise, clearing lanes through the minefields. But it cost them dearly, 800 New Zealand casualties. The South Africans took most of their targets too, though they left a dangerous gap on their northern flank. British sappers hunched low in the darkness, working under streams of tracer fire and the terrifying screams of Stuka dive bombers. Their mine detectors barely worked, forcing many to probe the sand inch by inch with bayonets, agonizingly slow and deadly dangerous. Anti-personnel mines exploded at waist height, spraying ball bearings that tore through flesh. It didn't take long for cleared corridors to be jammed with tanks and vehicles, lights out, blinded by swirling sand and dust, occasionally lit up by German flares that made them perfect targets. Confusion spread as tanks strayed from narrow paths and hit mines, triggering bright explosions. When dawn broke, it revealed a massive traffic jam stretching for miles, exposed beneath the rising sun. Exhaustion plagued everyone. Sleep-deprived drivers pushed on, seeing things that weren't there. One driver, John McCaskill, remembered traveling down a desert road he swore was, quote, lined with leafy trees, though he knew perfectly well nothing but sand stretched for miles in every direction. But Montgomery had been crystal clear. No retreat, no wavering. With ice-cold determination, he'd drawn his line, quote, if Alamein is lost, Egypt is lost. If we cannot stay at Alamein alive, we will stay there dead. So they pressed forward, crawling through the darkness, their fallen comrades marking each yard of hard-won ground. Operation Supercharge. In the southern sector, the 13th Corps' mission was to threaten Rommel enough to prevent him from redeploying units northward. Horrocks launched his 9th Armored Division, followed by infantry from the 44th and 50th Divisions, the Free French Brigade, and the 1st Greek Infantry Brigade, synchronized with the northern offensive. Initial progress came to a crawl when flail tanks kept breaking down, but eventually they punched a path through the Italian Folgore Parachute Division's sector. The Free French briefly grabbed the Hemmet peaks before the German Kielgruppe slammed into them. The French spirit crumbled, especially after losing their magnetic leader, Colonel Dmitry Emilekvari. Kielgruppe effectively derailed the entire 13th Corps advance, forcing the infantry to dig in defensively while Axis paratroopers tightened their noose. Montgomery's artillery and bombers had one unexpected success. They so thoroughly disrupted Axis communications that General Sturm died of a heart attack while under Australian fire. Lieutenant-General von Thoma stepped in temporarily. By daybreak on October 24th, the 30th Corps had partly hit its targets, carving a deep gash into enemy lines with surprisingly few losses. But the 10th Corps' armor failed to exploit the opening, enraging Montgomery, who threatened to sack commanders on the spot. Rommel returned at midnight on October 25th, 2 days into the battle. His mere presence lifted the spirits of his exhausted troops. What he found was grim. Montgomery's 8th Army had badly wounded the northern defenses, but hadn't broken through. Most British tanks were still bottlenecked behind their infantry, while German and Italian troops fought like demons for every foot of ground. Quick to spot Montgomery's southern feint, Rommel took a massive gamble. He shifted the powerful 21st Panzer Division north toward Kidney Ridge, leaving only the Italian Ariete Division exposed in the south. It was an enormous risk. If Montgomery attacked south now, Ariete would be trapped, and Rommel's entire southern flank would collapse. But Montgomery was throwing his weight northward. Around Kidney Ridge, the fighting turned brutally savage, with Highlanders and Australians battling viciously for control. Early in the fight, Axis armor, including the 15th Panzer and Italy's Littorio Division, surged forward in a desperate day-long assault. The Littorio tanks suffered catastrophic losses. Tanks hit by shells became rolling crematoriums, burning bodies trapped inside as the metal beasts, now driven by ghosts, rolled on toward their doom. For 6 merciless days, attacks and counterattacks chewed up men and machines. The casualty lists exploded. Over 2,000 Highlanders and more than 1,000 Australians dead or wounded. Eventually, both sides pulled back, utterly spent. But the Australians had gained a crucial toehold near the railway line, a dagger pointed at Rommel's flank. Montgomery was already planning his next hammer blow, Operation Supercharge. On November 2nd, infantry battalions, Durham Light Infantry, Highlanders, and New Zealand Maoris advanced at 1 a.m. behind a creeping barrage that detonated hundreds of mines ahead. Anti-aircraft guns fired tracers overhead, guiding troops through the chaos. By dawn, most infantry objectives fell, but tanks of the 9th Armored Brigade, arriving late, drove straight into hellfire. Caught by the rising sun, tank after tank exploded into flame under punishing artillery and anti-tank fire. Still, in a wild, fevered charge that echoed the madness of Balaclava, tanks plowed ahead, crushing enemy positions, artillery pieces and gunners underneath their metal tracks. Armored cars darted behind enemy lines, torching fuel dumps and blowing up transport vehicles. The brigade paid in blood. 270 men lost, and 71 tanks turned to smoking wrecks. But then the momentum dissipated. Montgomery's second wave of armor hesitated at the critical moment. Rommel pounced immediately, throwing the battered remains of his Panzer force into a desperate counterattack near Akakir. What followed was a brutal, grinding tank battle that left the desert strewn with burning steel coffins. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, Rommel faced disaster. He had fewer than 50 operational tanks against Montgomery's 500. With almost no anti-tank guns left, Rommel begged for permission to retreat, pleading his case against Hitler's insane no-surrender orders. When he finally got approval to pull back, the Axis forces simply fell apart, discipline collapsing into chaos as they fled. In the southern sector, the valiant Folgore Airborne Division fought to its last bullet, finally surrendering with only 306 survivors from an original 5,000. German and Italian soldiers fled, collapsing under wounds, starvation, and relentless pursuit. Senussi tribesmen scavenged the desert for weapons and valuables. The Axis defeat was total. The battlefield was soaked in blood, scattered with burning wrecks. The 8th Army suffered roughly 13,500 casualties, about 8% of the engaged forces, with most losses concentrated in the brutal fighting of the northern sector. Australian forces experienced 2,827 casualties, the 51st Highland Division 2,495, New Zealanders 2,388, and South Africans 922. German and Italian losses were catastrophic. Approximately 30,000 were captured, and around 20,000 more were killed or wounded. On November 15, 1942, Britain celebrated the pivotal victory at El Alamein, the first decisive triumph over German-led forces, by ringing church bells, silent since the war's onset. Churchill famously declared this victory to be, quote, not the end, perhaps the end of the beginning. As Churchill spoke, the 8th Army entered the battered port of Tobruk, chasing Rommel's forces westward across Libya into Tunisia, where Axis resistance ultimately collapsed by the spring of 1943. Montgomery emerged as a British hero, later commanding Allied forces in Sicily, Italy, and even Normandy, earning the distinguished title Montgomery of Alamein.